Hi there, and welcome back. In the previous video, we added a jump to our player, and the challenge was to configure the jump so it wouldn't jump that high. So let's go ahead and do that. And you can do that by changing the value of y. We'll set our value to 8, but the value that you choose there depends on how difficult of a game you're trying to make. If we set it to 8, it is easier to avoid obstacles, so the game difficulty will be lower. When you previewed the game, you might have noticed that the player collides before it hits the enemy. So there's a gap right here. And that is due to the collision shapes. And in this video, we're going to be looking how to adjust those collision shapes. If you want to see the collision shapes that are in your game in the preview, you can use the debug mode, and you can turn that on by clicking on the debug icon in the top left corner of the preview window. And when you do that, if you refresh the game now, you'll see all the collision shapes that are in the game. And now you can see clearly what the player is colliding with. And for enemy, instead of a triangle collision shape, we have a square collision shape, and the player collides with that before it visually reaches the enemy. So let's go ahead and configure the enemy collision shape, and we can do that by going into the 2D world and selecting our enemy. In the options, we have the start node, and we've configured the static physics for it. And once we turned on physics, we had all of these configurations that were added. And one of them is actually the collision shape. And the current collision shape that is selected is the cube. And we can check what options are available there. And we have cube, sphere, cylinder, hall, and mesh. Cube, sphere, or cylinder won't fit the shape that we want for our enemy. So we'll have to use hall or a mesh. We'll discuss the difference between hall and mesh later in the series, but currently for our enemy, we'll use the hall option. And when we select the hall option, we have another option that appears, and it's the collision mesh. Currently, it is empty, and if we leave it empty, we won't have any collision at all with our object. If we want to select a collision shape that we want to use, we can click on the added icon in the corner, and that will bring up all the objects that we have available. And the objects we have are cube, cylinder, plane, sphere, cone, torus, and another plane. And out of all these shapes, the closest one to a triangle will be the cone, and we will use the cone for our collision shapes. So you can select it by clicking on it and click Save. And now we have selected the cone as collision mesh. If we preview now, we can see that our collision shape changed for our enemy. And if we collide, we now collide with our new shape. If we turn off the debug and refresh again, we can see that effect again. And there is still a little gap that we have. And also we collide at the top. So there's still some adjustment that we need to do to our collision shape. And we can make that finer adjustment by going to collision shape edit mode. So make sure that your camera mode is turned off. Right next to the camera mode, we have the collision shape mode. And if we turn on that mode, we can see all the collision shapes of our assets. If we zoom in into our enemy collision shape, and you can zoom in by scrolling. If you need to move around in the view, you can hit space on a keyboard and then a left click and drag, and that will let you move around your scene. So currently it's hard to see where the triangle ends and where the collision shape starts. So what you can do is select the shape, and you can scale it down until you see the triangle shape, and then scale it back. And it's better to have the collision shape smaller than your visual so that the player doesn't feel cheated if he hits the enemy when he thought he wasn't supposed to hit the enemy. So by adjusting one of these collision shapes, you can see that all of our collision shapes for the enemy changed. And we don't have to do the same thing for all the other shapes. We can turn off the collision shape mode by clicking on that icon. Let's preview the game again. And now you can see that we are closer to colliding with our enemy. Let's turn on the debug mode again and see one more thing that we need to do. So one more thing that you might have noticed is that our player is actually also a cube. And the challenge before you start the next video is change the collision shape of the player to its appropriate shape. Also, be sure to check out our video on physics collision shape, in which we go through more details about mesh and hull, and we'll have lots of demonstrations there. And once you do that challenge, you're ready for the next video. And in the next video, we'll be adding points into our game.